final two sections of the chapter on the discipline of pure reason are about hypotheses first and then proofs. So when it comes to hypotheses, the worry that Kant has is the following. If we have learned that there are so many things that we can't know, that there are all these bounds to our knowledge, then aren't we allowed to just think up whatever we want about all this stuff that is unknowable to us? So here's how Kant starts. He says, since then, through the critique of our reason, we finally know that we cannot in fact know anything at all in its pure and speculative use. Should it not then open up an all the wider field for hypotheses? Okay, to a certain extent it does, Kant is going to say, but there are some rules for a good hypothesis in the different fields of human thinking. If the imagination is not simply to enthuse, that is generally not a positive word for Kant. Enthusiasm sort of means getting carried away by, maybe your emotions or your imagination and doing stuff for which you have no real warrant. If the imagination is not simply to enthuse, but is under the strict oversight of reason to invent, something must always first be fully certain and not invented or a mere opinion, and that is the possibility of the object itself. In that case, it is permissible to take refuge in opinion concerning the actuality of the object, which opinion, however, in order not to be groundless, must be connected as a ground of explanation with that which is actually given and consequently certain, and it is then called an hypothesis. So Kant is now basically going to talk about what contemporary philosophers might call inference to the best explanation, or abduction, or something like that. The idea is that something is given to us and we try to explain it. And, such a purported explanation is a hypothesis. And whatever the hypothesis is about might not itself be given to us, but at least it is connected with something that is given to us. Okay, Kant goes on to say that we shouldn't let our imagination run wild. When we come up with hypotheses, we should have some insight into the possibility of what we posit. And that means that we shouldn't posit as explanations of our experiences, for instance, things that are of a totally different kind from anything that we have experienced. And so he tells us that we should not think up any sort of new original forces, like an understanding that is capable of intuiting its object without sense, or an attractive force without any contact, or a new kind of substance, like one which would be present in space without impenetrability, and so on and so forth. That would be a ghost, I guess. Not sure why, an attractive force without any content, that's basically the modern understanding of, or it's one of the modern understandings of gravity. So Kant is maybe not being entirely uncontroversial here with his examples. But the idea seems to be relatively proper, right? I mean, if you want to explain some things, then the closer you can stay to the known, to the kinds of things that you are familiar with and know through experience to be possible, the better. And the wilder the hypotheses are, the worse. That seems to be sort of a methodological stricture that Kant is giving us here. Okay, what about transcendental hypotheses? A772, Kant writes, a transcendental hypothesis, in which a mere idea of reason would be used for the explanation of things in nature, would thus be no explanation at all, since that which one does not adequately understand on the basis of known empirical principles would be explained by means of something about which one understands nothing at all. Right? So the worst kind of hypothesis to use in natural science is to posit something like God and say, well, this happened because God did it. Right? That is not an acceptable kind of explanation. That is sort of giving up the very project of trying to gain empirical knowledge. It is lazy reason. Kant has told us to this before at the end of the dialectic. The second point Kant wants to make, A774. The second point which is requisite to make a hypothesis worthy of being assumed is its adequacy for determining a priori the consequences that are given. My translation has "these are given," which doesn't make any sense. And also doesn't fit the German. So the second point which is requisite to make a hypothesis worthy of being assumed is its adequacy for determining a priori the consequences that are given. So, basically what we need is an hypothesis that actually leads to the results that we are trying to get. And Kant uses this to further criticize some of these transcendental hypotheses, like the soul. If I bring the soul as a simple substance into science, into empirical science, then it turns out that actually this only leads to more problems. Because the soul as a simple substance can't explain any of the alterations that take place in my mental life, for instance. So then I need to bring in further hypotheses to explain that, and, all of this doesn't seem very plausible or very promising. So what Kant concludes from this, if we are looking at the field of pure reason, like when we are doing transcendental philosophy, or when we are doing philosophy, maybe I should say, when we are trying to get, purely rational insight into the world, then hypotheses are only allowed in a very special sense, and this is A777. Hypotheses are therefore allowed in the field of pure reason only as weapons of war, not for grounding a right, but only for defending it. However, here we must always seek the enemy in ourselves. What does Kant mean? Well, the situation Kant is thinking of is the situation where I, based on practical reasons, say something like, I believe in the existence of a soul, right? And then somebody comes along and say, no, you can't have a soul, not like this kind of eternal substance, because, and then he comes up with some story, because there's actually alteration, or because it turns out that mental life is dependent on the physical organs, something like that. Then Kant says you are allowed to come up with hypotheses, and he gives some pretty speculative hypotheses here about how the soul and the body might, from an ontological point of view, hang together. The point of which is not to say that that is true, that these hypotheses are true, but only to show that what the opponent said, namely that our belief was impossible, isn't right. Right? We can come up with these scenarios in which, okay, at least it makes logical sense, so nobody can say that it's wrong. Again, we have seen this so many times before, we see it again. Kant really wants to make sure that we always have the room to posit on practical grounds something like an eternal life and a soul and God and stuff like that, and to ensure that theoretical reason can't bring anything against that. And this is another example of that. We must always seek the enemy here in ourselves. That's nice, right? I mean, Kant says, we're not doing this because we want to fight the people around us. If you really want to bring reason forward, look in yourself for your own convictions. Come up with your own counter-arguments, right? That's a proper use of reason. Okay, so far about hypotheses. In the fourth section, Kant is going to talk about proofs. And he's going to give us some rule for proving things in transcendental philosophy. Let's walk through those rules. The first rule, A786. The first rule, therefore, is this: to attempt no transcendental proofs without having first considered whence one can justifiably derive the principles on which one intends to build, and with what right one can expect success in inferences from them. So this is a very basic methodological rule of transcendental philosophy. Make sure that you actually do the transcendental thing, right? Make sure that you inquire after the grounds of your cognition. What kind of cognition is it? How could you get any certainty about it? And so on and so forth. When a deduction is necessary, give a deduction. That is basically the first rule. The second peculiarity, Kant now says, it's not apparently a second rule. The second peculiarity of transcendental proofs, A787, is this: that for each transcendental proposition only a single proof can be found. Why? Well, Kant says when it comes to like a mathematical or an empirical thing, we have intuition in all its multiplicity, and maybe there are many different intuitions we could use to prove some particular statement. But when it comes to transcendental philosophy, we just start from one concept alone. So this is at the bottom of 787. Every transcendental proposition proceeds solely from one concept and states the synthetic condition of the possibility of the object in accordance with this concept. The ground of proof can therefore only be unique, since outside this concept there is nothing further by means of which the object could be determined. Maybe, right? I don't know how it immediately follows that, one concept couldn't feature in several different proofs, but okay, apparently Kant believes that that is the case. What is kind of nice is, the lesson he draws from this, that when you see, and this is 789, when you see the dogmatist step forth with 10 proofs, one can be sure that he has none at all. Right? If somebody comes to you and says, oh, I've proven the existence of God, here are 10 proofs, Kant says, why do you need more than one? Right? If you could really prove this, then surely one proof would be enough. And in fact, we have this reason a priori to believe that one proof is the most there can be. Okay. Here's the third special rule, also at 789. If it is subjected to a discipline in regard to transcendental proofs, its proofs must never be apagogic, but always ostensive. Okay, what is an apagogic or apagogic or well, who knows how to pronounce this? I don't. That is because you never see this word, and you never see this word because we call this in contemporary English a proof by contradiction. Right? So what Kant is talking about here is a proof by contradiction versus a, direct proof, a positive proof, whatever you want to call it. So what Kant tells us is that in transcendental philosophy, we are never allowed to have a proof by contradiction. Why not? Well, it's the concept itself, the possibility of the object. We want to show that this concept is necessary for objects to be possible, right? In order to do that, we have to show that this concept is necessary in order to make objects possible, objects of experience. That's what we have to do. There's this positive task before us. Merely showing that if we don't assume something, then we get into a contradiction, or that if we take the opposite of our claim, that brings us into a contradiction, is not good enough for Kant. It's not good enough because there's all kinds of difficulties that this sort of steps over. Right? What it assumes, in particular, what it assumes is that of these two options, A and B, one of them has to be true and one of them has to be false. But we have already seen that reason is easily misled in this regard. Everything that happened in the antinomy was an example of reason being misled in this regard, and reason using proofs by contradiction in an attempt to show that its own preferred position is true without having the least idea how to prove, like positively, the validity of your own position. Right? And so Kant says in Transcendental Philosophy, showing that your opponent is right, that is never enough. You've got to showing that your opponent is wrong is never enough. You've got to show that you yourself are right. Alright, so those were some methodological rules for doing transcendental philosophy. It's a bit of a sort of a grab bag. It seems like, there's just some points here that Kant wants to make in the transcendental doctrine and method. And he has made a couple of them in this chapter about the discipline. The next chapter is the Canon of Pure Reason, in which we are going to talk, and this is, of course, supremely important for Kant, about the ultimate end of the pure use of reason and the relations between a theoretical and practical reason.